Hello, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Shara Vickers. I'm a graduate student in the Applied Nutrition program at the University of New England. Recently, I had the opportunity to explore which worksite wellness programs work best for shift workers. Before I get into the results and my findings, I would like to share with you a little story. Not that long ago, I was working in the hospitality industry. I usually worked a night audit shift, which meant that I came into work between 10:30 and 11 p.m. and stayed until 6 or 7 the next morning. Late one night, or perhaps early one morning, it was about 5 a.m., the newspapers had arrived, the coffee was made, and the cook was in the kitchen preparing breakfast for guests who would soon be coming down to start their days, when one of our colleagues arrived to report in for her shift. She had a look at the newspaper on the desk and said, "Oh, would you look at that now?" And I said, "Oh, what are you reading?" And she said, "Oh, not much. We're all gonna die." At which point she tucked the newspaper under her arm, turned, and headed down to the staff room to get ready for her day. I was curious, of course, to see what she had read to make her react in such a way, so I flipped over the newspaper and saw a headline much like this. "Night shift work may be tough on your heart. Night shift work may be tough on a woman's heart. Night shift work may harm women's heart health." It's because of my background in the hospitality industry and other industries where I've been required to work shifts and my interest in worksite health promotion that led me to today's research topic. So, as part of my research, I conducted a systematic review, and I will share those findings with you today. But first, I'm just going to go through a little bit of the process so you know what to expect. We'll start discussing the background. I'll let you in on my search strategy and methods. We'll discuss the results and conclusions and have a little discussion on the implications for practice and what it all means. So, jumping right into the background. Currently, 30% of the U.S. workforce are shift workers. This doesn't necessarily mean that they are working overnight shifts. They could be working any combination of day, evening, weekend, or a rotation, but they do work outside of those standard 8 to 5, 9 to 4 hours. Generally, we think of first responders and healthcare workers in this area, but there are more and more working class positions opening up that are also shift work. These include manufacturing work, cleaners, attendants, and those like myself in various forms of the service industry. Shift workers are known to have a variety of health-related issues, and they have a higher risk for these issues than the general population. They have higher rates of overweight and obesity, which is the focus of the research here today. They also tend to have poor sleep. They're at a higher risk of diabetes. They tend to experience sleep apnea and are at a higher risk of cardiovascular disease in a variety of forms. The reasons for this are not precisely clear. Changes in the circadian rhythm are thought to play a role. The circadian rhythm is basically our body's sleep-wake cycle, and we are learning through research that our exposure to light and dark influences all sorts of things, not just our awakeness or our fatigue. It's associated with mental health, depression, seasonal affective disorder. It also affects our body's hormonal responses. It can affect our blood pressure and our responses to food, among other things. So when you eat something at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and eat the exact same thing at 3 in the morning, your body may have a different biological response. Additionally, shift workers tend to have higher levels of modifiable risk factors. That means that they tend to make poor food choices. I know I did. The choices at 3, 4, 5 in the morning aren't always the best. They often have lower activity levels, higher level of smoking status, and of course, increased caffeine use. So these are all things to consider. Research also shows that certain industries or certain socioeconomic status are associated with higher risks or higher modifiable risk factors in general, but shift workers, even when compared to day workers in the same industry, again, tend to have even further elevated risks beyond their counterparts. So shift work does really seem to play a role. Worksite wellness programs are, it's generally accepted that well-funded, evidence-based programs work. However, we're still contributing to that evidence base, and we don't know the precise mechanisms that make the ideal worksite wellness program. There are also concerns that shift workers may need targeted help that's different from what day workers may receive. Shift workers may not benefit from general health supports, or if you're like me, you're obligated to show up at 2 o'clock in the afternoon after working the night before for a health and wellness seminar and then you have to report back at 11 o'clock at night. So shift workers may not benefit the same way. In fact, in my experience, some of us may even sleep through the occasional seminar that's outside of our normal hours. Of course, that wouldn't be myself. No, it really wasn't me, but I have seen other people nod off, and it's to be expected, I would think. All programs and outcomes are not created equal, so we want to constantly evaluate and reevaluate to know which programs work best. And shift workers are, as we see, a population with special needs, and they may need special accommodation. So the methods for my research here. My research question was, which program designs and delivery models yield the most clinically meaningful obesity-related results for shift-working population? I've chose to focus on obesity because that's where the majority of the research is, and because obesity relates to so many other health problems, including cardiovascular disease and diabetes. It's limited to blue-collar and working-class people, so as to eliminate the confounds associated with white-collar shift work or healthcare-related shift work. I performed a systematic search of PubMed and ProQuest databases. I included English language peer-reviewed literature published since 2009. Other pre-established inclusion criteria included dealing with a population greater than 10, for example. We didn't want to use really small studies. Didn't actually find any of those anyway. Other pre-established criteria included had to be some sort of pre-test, post-test data, ideally with a comparison or a randomized clinical trial when I could, and other sets of criteria that were pre-established so we knew what would be included in the research. There we go. Sorry about that. As part of the data collection process, I did a pilot review just to give me an idea of what was in the research, what was included, the methods that were used among the programs. I also did a quality analysis and risk of bias assessment. I used the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics Evidence Analysis Manual, the resources there to perform this. I looked at setting, sample size, study design, and the endpoint data. I also looked at the components of the intervention, whether a behavior change theory was used, the delivery model, the type of facilitator, the duration, and whether or not the program had been adapted for shift work. I presented this data in a table and synthesized it in a narrative review, and I'm going to share some of these results with you here. Initially, I had 955 records based on the general search. I narrowed that down to 45 abstracts. When you search for shift work and health, you get all sorts of research, but I wanted to focus on the worksite wellness interventions. I also identified another 11 papers based on hand searching from other systematic reviews and meta-analysis and other types of reviews, and ultimately included 6 papers for review, which we'll be discussing here today. The first study I'd like to talk about was a pre-test, post-test, non-randomized trial. It involved workers in the motor freight industry, so dock workers and truck drivers. They all had a BMI of greater than 30, and it was a 4-month intervention. This intervention included focus groups, phone-based counseling, mail-outs. It was modified from another worksite intervention that had been successful. It focused on weight loss and smoking cessation, and it was based in the social cognitive theory, motivational interviewing, and the readiness to change model. The CARRY study was conducted in a firehouse. It included 1 platoon of 10 members. This was a bit of a pilot study within a larger study, and the firefighters had a mean BMI of 29.9, so just short of 30, which is the cutoff for obesity. Again, it was a pre-test, post-test design. It had 12 weeks of very specific dietary changes. The changes were low glycemic index, but also included elements of the DASH, dietary approaches to stop hypertension diet, and the Mediterranean diet. It included group exercise classes and group education. The facilitators were a doctor, nurse, and fitness instructor. It monitored weight change and other metabolic risk factors, such as lipids and glucose, for example. The GEESE study was conducted in a manufacturing plant. It had 35 participants with a body mass index greater than 25, so these people were more in the overweight to obese category. It evaluated weight loss and body composition. It was 16 weeks, and it was modified of a curriculum that's offered to individuals, and it was offered at convenient times for the participants. However, it was noted that very often participants chose to work overtime rather than attend sessions, so that is something to note here. It was facilitated by a certified diabetes educator who was also a nurse. It offered system-level supports, including cafeteria changes and site-wide health screening at the entire work site. It was based in the socio-ecological model, but also touched on elements of the theory of human caring, which emphasizes a close relationship between a nurse and her patients. The Ferrero study was conducted in a corrections facility. It had 24 participants. Initially, it was much larger, but intended to be much larger, but there was some restructuring and several people were relocated or lost their position. So they ultimately ended up with 24 participants with a BMI of 33.2. They were mostly women. Again, it had pre-test, post-test data. It evaluated weight and body mass index. It was a 12-week program with 8-week follow-up. It had a participatory design, which means that what was included in the program was determined by a design team and evaluated by a steering committee. So the workers and the dietitian who developed this program wanted to ensure it was the most appropriate work program for this work site. Primarily, the health education used CDC resources that were custom tailored for this particular work site, and it had an incentive raffle for completers. The Morgan study was done in a manufacturing plant, 110 men. Again, obese body mass index was the mean. It was a prospective 2-arm randomized controlled trial. Weight, self-reported data, and exercise. It was 12 weeks with a 14-week follow-up period. It only had 1 in-person session and email and web support. It was based in the social cognitive theory. It included trained facilitators and incentives for the most successful crew, and it was modified from another intervention targeting men. The Gainey study was again in a manufacturing plant. It was a cluster-controlled with 3 intervention arms and 1 control arm. It evaluated body mass index, salt intake, nutrition knowledge. 1 arm was nutrition education alone. 1 arm was environmental change alone, so changes into the worksite cafeteria and vending machines, for example. And the 3rd was combined education and environmental support. It was based on nudge theory and the socio-ecological model and involved group and individual education. If I sound like I'm repeating myself here, there is a little bit of a point to that. You can see that these interventions were all very similar. I guess I was perhaps naive starting out, and I thought that maybe there would be 5 or 6 really great interventions that all use the same thing, and they were the most successful, and then there'd be 2 or 3 outliers who did something else and weren't as successful. But the reality is that all of these were really good interventions, and all of them did achieve positive outcomes. I'd like to point out that my study here focused on clinically meaningful weight loss, which is usually 5% or greater. That does not mean that these interventions weren't successful in other areas. Some focused on general healthy eating, and they have improved there, but didn't improve in body weight, specifically within the trial period. The Sorensen study, for example, had positive effects for smoking cessation, but didn't do as well in weight loss. But the goal of my research here was to focus on clinically meaningful weight loss, which left us with 3 studies, Morgan, Carey, and Ferrero. So we wanted to look at what set these 3 studies apart. Personal accountability was a big factor. A group or team dynamic was also important, and all of these emphasized weight loss. With personal accountability, 2 of the studies involved the use of a pedometer for daily activity tracking. 2 of the studies required recording dietary intake and physical activity, 1 paper and pen, and 1 was web-based. And the other study had regular goal setting and monitoring on a week-to-week basis. There was also a group or team dynamic. The corrections facility didn't have a team competition. However, because it was designed by the participants, there was a great sense of ownership, and there was encouragement for participation among all employees and management alike. And the 3rd was a platoon of firefighters who already have a close working dynamic, and of course were offered the opportunity to work out together and attend classes together while they were otherwise on the clock, which is of course a luxury that may not be available at all work sites, but it is something worth considering. And all of these studies emphasize weight loss either through raffles, through the type of education that was offered. Rather than going to a healthy eating class, they went to breakfasts that burn fat class. They had fat torching workouts as opposed to just general fitness classes. So there was an emphasis on weight loss. And these three factors, I think, may have helped drive the success of these interventions, and may indeed be what set them apart from the others that weren't as successful in producing weight-related outcomes. So, discussion. My research, of course, was based on some of the most recent research. The study included research studies from the last 10 years and diverse locations and work sites. We had a firehouse, a corrections facility, and a few manufacturing plants. So there is a good mix involved in the research here. There are several weaknesses, largely stemming from the fact that there's not a whole lot in the academic literature that focuses on worksite wellness for shift workers. There's a small pool of studies included here, so there's a risk of bias with that. There's also a risk of bias within the research. It's hard to set up a randomized clinical trial in a worksite venue. Some of the researchers here have been able to do that. However, because employees are very often they choose to be part of the worksite wellness program and they aren't obligated to attend it, there is a risk of self-selection bias. Also that, the samples from study to study and site to site may not be representative. They may not be ultimately comparable, although you did see similarities in the research here. Generally speaking, most researchers reported that the samples they worked with were representative of the greater work site, so that is a bonus. The implication for practice, and I am going to pop back on the screen here so I feel like I'm actually speaking with you. There's a need for more research and more consistent reporting, of course. Ultimately, finding better ways to do research with these groups. Currently, in the United States, worksite wellness is an $8 billion industry. I think more of that time and money could be spent on a research end of things. When you look at the research, there's lots there, but does it reflect an $8 billion industry? Maybe not. As we grow and offer more and more worksite wellness programs, which do tend to be effective, we want to, again, better establish what works best and what works best for each work site and its employees. So I think there is a benefit there to doing regular reviews such as this, constantly doing evidence analysis, systematic reviews, meta-analysis, just to see that we are keeping up with things and realizing that there are some gaps in the research. There are populations and subsets of populations, certain types of workers who may not be accounted for in the research and who, like shift workers, may need a little bit of extra help or extra assistance. So with that, I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. I really enjoyed this project and I appreciate having the opportunity to share my results and findings with you. Thank you for your time, and I'm just going to close out by showing you my references. Thank you.